Welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we follow the long and uncertain course of the American Revolution, from its first gunfire to the victory that secured independence. Settle in and join me for a calm journey through the war that created the United States. The boats moved in darkness. Oarsmen pulled against the current of the East River while soldiers loaded in silence, stepping carefully onto wooden hulls slicked with August damp. It was late summer of 1776, and the Continental Army was running. They were not yet sure they would survive the night. 2 days earlier, on the fields and ridges of Long Island, the British Army had delivered a crushing blow. General William Howe had manoeuvred a large force around the American left flank in the hours before dawn, turning a prepared defensive position into a rout. Hundreds of Continental soldiers had been captured or killed. The survivors had fallen back to a fortified perimeter on the edge of Brooklyn, with their backs to the East River, and British troops tightening their lines in front. George Washington had crossed from Manhattan and watched the catastrophe unfold. His army was trapped. The British Navy controlled the harbour. Howe had only to wait, or press forward, and the main body of the Continental Army would be destroyed. The rebellion, which had declared itself a nation barely 6 weeks earlier, might end before it reached its first autumn. Washington made a decision that had to work perfectly, or not at all. He would withdraw. Every man, every cannon, every supply the boats could carry would be pulled back across the water to Manhattan during the night of August 29th. The operation required complete silence, steady oarsmen, favourable conditions, and enough darkness to conceal 9,000 men from a watching enemy. The operation took nearly 9 hours. Regiments moved down to the waterfront in careful rotation. Soldiers who knew how to handle boats, including a regiment of Massachusetts fishermen and sailors, managed much of the crossing. The wind shifted against the operation in the early hours, slowing progress. Morning began to lighten the water before the last units reached the shore. A low fog settled over the river, thickening in the first grey of dawn. It helped conceal the final crossings from British observers on the far bank. By full light, the last boats had landed in Manhattan, and George Washington was among the final men to cross. The army had escaped. But it had escaped into a crisis. It had lost Long Island. It would soon lose New York City. Within weeks it would lose most of Manhattan and be retreating through New Jersey, with its numbers shrinking by the day. The summer of 1776 had become one of the most dangerous seasons in the short life of the American independence movement. And so the question that would haunt the next 7 years of this war was already pressing itself forward on that river in the fog. How does an army like this survive? How does a collection of colonies that disagreed on almost everything hold together long enough to win? How does a rebellion that declared a nation in July manage to still exist by December? Welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we trace the full arc of the American Revolution. How 13 colonies went to war with the British Empire, how that war spread across a continent and an ocean, and how the improbable survival of a cause became the recognized independence of a nation. If this kind of history is why you come here, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to support it. This is a long and unhurried journey, intended for the quiet hours. Settle in and let it carry you through one of history's most consequential struggles. America turns 250 in 2026, and that anniversary is worth understanding fully, not as a story of inevitable triumph, but as a story of survival against genuine odds. The story does not begin in July 1776. It begins more than a year earlier, in the spring of 1775, when the fighting had already started and no one was yet certain what they were fighting for. War before independence. The morning of April 19th, 1775 began with a rider, and then with gunfire. Paul Revere and others had ridden through the night to alert the towns of Middlesex County in Massachusetts that British regulars were marching from Boston. The mission had been kept secret for weeks by General Thomas Gage, the military governor. His orders were to seize colonial military supplies stored at Concord, a market town about 17 miles northwest of Boston. The colonists, who had been accumulating powder, cannon, and muskets for months, were to be disarmed. The alarm reached Lexington before dawn. Militia Captain John Parker assembled roughly 70 men on the town common. When the British column arrived, led by Major John Pitcairn, Parker's men were badly outnumbered. Someone fired a shot. Historians still disagree about which side fired first, and the question was disputed immediately by participants. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen were dead and 10 were wounded. The British column continued to Concord. At Concord's North Bridge, a larger group of militia had assembled. When smoke was seen rising from part of the town, British soldiers had set fire to some supplies, and the fire spread briefly to a building. The militia advanced. A volley was exchanged. British soldiers began to fall back. The column that had marched out of Boston with precision began to find the road home increasingly dangerous as militia from surrounding towns gathered along the route and fired from stone walls and tree lines. By the time the column reached the safety of reinforcements at Lexington, it had taken substantial casualties. The news spread faster than horses could carry it. Within days, thousands of men from across Massachusetts and neighbouring colonies had surrounded Boston. Within weeks, provincial governments across New England were organising their forces. Within months, delegates from all 13 colonies were meeting in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress, trying to decide what to do next. The situation was unlike anything the colonists had prepared for. They had grievances, many of them real and long accumulating. Parliament had taxed them without their representation. British officials had quartered soldiers in colonial towns. Courts had been altered. Customs enforcement had grown aggressive. The Boston Massacre of 1770, in which soldiers fired into a crowd and killed 5 people, had left a wound that did not heal. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 and the punishing coercive acts that followed had pushed colonial patience toward its limit. But grievance is not the same thing as a war plan. Most colonists in the spring of 1775 did not want permanent separation from Britain. They wanted Parliament to acknowledge their rights as British subjects, particularly the right not to be taxed without consent. They wanted the coercive acts repealed. Many hoped that armed resistance would shock Britain into concession, and that the conflict could be settled without a final break. The colonies Washington would eventually command were not unified, an understanding that fragmentation matters as much as understanding any battle. The 13 colonies had different economies, different religious landscapes, different relationships to the British imperial system, and different ideas about how far resistance should go. New England's Congregationalist communities, with their tradition of town meeting governance and their long experience of self-administration, were culturally prepared for confrontation in ways that Virginia's planter gentry or Philadelphia's merchant communities were not. Pennsylvania had a large Quaker population committed to pacifism. New York had powerful commercial interests deeply tied to British trade. Georgia and South Carolina had plantation economies so dependent on enslaved labour and British markets that their planters had reasons to hesitate before embracing a rebellion whose ultimate consequences they could not predict. What brought these different communities to the same Congress was not agreement on what independence should mean. It was the more immediate pressure of events. The coercive acts had made clear that Parliament was willing to use military force to impose its will. Delegates who had not committed to permanent separation could nonetheless agree that colonial rights needed defending, and that some coordinated response was necessary. That was enough to start a Congress, if not yet enough to start a nation. The Second Continental Congress, which convened in May 1775, wrestled with this tension. It was not a government. It had no treasury, no judicial power, no executive authority. It was a meeting of delegates from separate colonies, each with its own laws, its own traditions, and its own ideas about how far resistance should go. Delegates from the middle colonies, particularly Pennsylvania and New York, urged caution and continued petitions to the king. Delegates from New England, where the fighting was already happening, demanded action. The action Congress took cautiously and without formally declaring itself a sovereign government was to create an army. On June 14, 1775, Congress voted to establish the Continental Army, drawing the existing Massachusetts forces and other provincial troops under a unified command. The next day, it chose a commander, John Adams of Massachusetts, who understood that Southern support for a New England war would require a Southern commander, proposed George Washington of Virginia. Washington was 43 years old, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a member of the Virginia gentry, and a man whose bearing and reputation communicated the kind of steadiness Congress needed to project. Washington accepted without enthusiasm and without false modesty. He told Congress he did not feel equal to the command. He declined a salary, asking only that his expenses be reimbursed. He wrote to his wife Martha at Mount Vernon with something close to apology, explaining that duty had compelled him to take on a responsibility he had not sought. He then rode north toward Boston, toward an army he had never seen, toward a war whose purpose was still being debated by the very body that had sent him. Bunker Hill had already happened before he arrived. In June 1775, colonial forces had occupied Breed's Hill, a position adjacent to Bunker Hill, commanding the approach to Boston Harbor, and were dislodged by British assault after 2 bloody repulses. The British carried the position on the third attack, but at a cost that shocked officers accustomed to more decisive victories. More than 200 British soldiers were killed and 800 wounded in a fight for a single hill. The colonial forces, withdrawing in reasonable order rather than routing, had demonstrated something important: that untrained men behind fortifications could make a professional army pay a steep price. Neither side had yet committed to the logic of where this was heading. Britain still expected the rebellion to collapse or settle. The colonists still hoped Britain would negotiate, but the men dying at Breed's Hill were not fighting for negotiation points. They were fighting because the other side was already there. Washington reached Cambridge, Massachusetts, in early July 1775 and took formal command of the forces gathered around Boston. He was not yet certain what he had inherited. He was about to find out, and the discovery would not reassure him. Making an army. The army that George Washington inherited in the summer of 1775 was not an army in any conventional sense. It was a gathering of men from different colonies, serving under different officers, organized by different rules, with different expectations about when they might go home. Washington found problems he had not fully anticipated. The men were brave enough, but discipline was loose. Officers from one colony sometimes refused to cooperate with officers from another. Soldiers elected their own officers in some units, which made formal hierarchy difficult to enforce. Sanitation in the camps around Boston was poor, and disease moved quickly through dense and unregulated encampments. The army's relationship to the civilian population it was theoretically defending was complicated by the fact that foraging, theft, and unauthorized absence were all common. The supply situation was worse. Washington discovered within weeks of taking command that the army's stock of gunpowder was a fraction of what had been reported to him. His correspondence in the late summer of 1775 reveals a commander who understood that if the British pressed forward, he had almost nothing with which to stop them. He concealed this weakness carefully, maintaining the appearance of readiness while working through Congress and the states to acquire powder, cannon, and lead. Disease was a greater killer than British arms throughout the war, and the camps around Boston introduced Washington to this reality early. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and respiratory illnesses spread easily in close quarters among men with little immunity to the particular diseases circulating in military camps. Washington would eventually make the consequential decision to inoculate his army against smallpox, overcoming significant resistance, because the process of deliberately inducing a mild form of the disease was genuinely risky, and some soldiers feared it more than they feared battle. The mass inoculation program was one of Washington's most important administrative decisions. Smallpox had devastated the Quebec invasion force, and an army crippled by the disease could not function in any theatre. The supply problem that plagued Washington from the first weeks of his command reflected deep structural limits in how the Continental Congress was organized. The Articles of Confederation, which Congress was debating and would eventually adopt, created a central body that could make requests but could not compel compliance. It could ask states to provide men and money. It could not force them. It had no power to tax. It could issue paper currency, continentals, but could not prevent those bills from depreciating as the war's costs exceeded public confidence in the new government's staying power. Washington's army went unpaid, undersupplied, and underfed not because anyone wanted it to, but because the political structure of the Confederation could not efficiently gather resources from 13 separate states and deliver them to a single fighting force. Short enlistments made the underlying manpower problem structural. Most soldiers in 1775 had agreed to serve only through the end of the year. As December approached, Washington faced the prospect of watching his forces dissolve and having to begin again with largely new men. He pleaded with Congress for longer enlistment terms. Congress, wary of the political optics of demanding too much from a free population, was slow to act. The recurring crisis of expiring enlistments would follow Washington through the first years of the war. The Army's composition was more varied than later memory often suggests. From the earliest months, free black men served in the Continental forces. Some had been present at Lexington and Concord. Some served with the forces around Boston. Washington initially resisted their enlistment, reflecting both the racial attitudes of his time and concerns about how slaveholding colonies to the south would respond to an army that enrolled black soldiers. But as manpower demands grew, policy shifted. By the war's later years, free black men served in integrated units across several states, and some enslaved men gained their freedom through military service, though the terms and the results varied considerably from person to person and from state to state. Women were present in the Army's life from the beginning, though rarely in formal military roles. Camp followers, wives, mothers, daughters, and other women attached to military units performed labour that was essential to the Army's daily function: cooking, washing, nursing the sick and wounded, and carrying supplies. The Army regulated their presence because it could not do without them. Martha Washington came to camp during winter seasons throughout the war, and her presence was understood to matter for morale among officers and soldiers alike. The practical business of the siege of Boston was unglamorous. Washington extended and improved the American lines around the city. He drilled his men, imposed discipline through punishment when necessary, and worked to establish the chain of command that an army requires to function. He sent letters, a constant stream of letters, to Congress, to the state governments, to suppliers, to officers in the field, managing through correspondence a military operation that had no reliable administrative machinery behind it. The breakthrough came from an unlikely direction. Henry Knox was 25 years old, a Boston bookseller who had educated himself in military engineering and artillery through intensive reading. He had joined the Continental forces and proposed something that should not have been possible, hauling the cannon captured at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in New York overland through the Berkshire Mountains to Boston in the middle of winter. Ticonderoga had fallen to a small Patriot force under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in May 1775, and its artillery, dozens of cannon and mortars of various sizes, was sitting unused while the siege of Boston produced no tactical result. Knox convinced Washington, secured authorization, and departed in November 1775. The overland journey of perhaps 60 artillery pieces, estimates vary and some accounts are more reliable than others, crossed nearly 300 miles of winter terrain. Knox used oxen, sledges and boats across Lake George. He moved cannon weighing hundreds to over 1,000 pounds each across frozen rivers and mountain passes. Men and animals fell through ice. Loads had to be rebuilt after accidents. The journey took about 2 months and arrived in Cambridge in late January 1776. Washington now had the artillery to make the siege matter. In early March, using the cannon Knox had delivered, he ordered the fortification of Dorchester Heights south of Boston in a single overnight operation. Soldiers worked through the night of March 4th, moving earth and timber to create fortifications that commanding views of Boston Harbour and the British fleet. When the British woke on March 5th to find cannon overlooking their position, the situation had changed. General Howe considered attacking Dorchester Heights, as his predecessors had attacked Breed's Hill. He chose not to. The position was strong, the weather turned against a naval assault, and the calculation of cost versus gain did not favour pressing forward. By mid-March, Howe had made a different decision. He would evacuate. On March 17th, 1776, British forces and roughly 1,000 Loyalist civilians who feared what Patriot authority would mean for them boarded ships and sailed from Boston. They carried what they could and left what they could not. Washington entered the city that afternoon. It was his first clear military success, achieved without a pitched battle, through the combination of artillery, fortification, and patient pressure. Boston was free, but the British force had not been destroyed. It had left. And Washington understood, reading the newspapers and the intelligence reports, that the British government was preparing a response on a scale the colonies had not yet faced. The campaign ahead would not look like the siege of Boston. Canada, the sea, and a widening war. Even before the siege of Boston produced results, the Continental Congress had authorized a second front. An invasion of Canada, the thinking went, might bring the large British province into the independence movement, remove a source of potential British counterattack, and extend Patriot influence northward. It was an ambitious goal. It was also, in practice, a catastrophe. 2 separate forces moved toward Canada in the autumn of 1775. General Richard Montgomery led a column north along the traditional water route through Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River toward Montreal. A second force, under Colonel Benedict Arnold, undertook one of the most punishing marches in American military history, a route through the Maine wilderness, through rivers and bogs and forests that stripped the column of supplies, health, and a significant fraction of its men before it ever reached Canadian territory. Arnold's force lost perhaps 1/3 of its men to exhaustion, disease, and the decision by some soldiers to turn back before reaching the St. Lawrence River. Those who completed the journey did so in a condition of extreme physical depletion. Montgomery captured Montreal and moved east to join Arnold's survivors outside Quebec City in December 1775. The combined force was outnumbered, poorly supplied, and running out of time. Enlistments in Arnold's force were expiring at the end of the year. Montgomery and Arnold decided to assault Quebec's walls during a winter storm on the night of December 30th. The assault failed badly. Montgomery was killed in the opening minutes. Arnold was wounded. The surviving forces maintained a weak siege through the brutal Canadian winter, their numbers shrinking from disease and desertion, their position worsening as spring made British naval reinforcement possible. By summer 1776, what remained of the American force in Canada was in full retreat. The campaign accomplished none of its military objectives. Canada did not join the rebellion. Quebec City remained firmly British. The northern invasion had cost the Continental cause hundreds of prisoners, thousands of sick and dead, and enormous amounts of equipment and supplies that could not be replaced easily. What it did produce, almost by accident, was a delay. During the retreat from Canada, Benedict Arnold organised a naval force on Lake Champlain. Arnold was a former merchant captain with practical seamanship, and he understood that British control of the lake would allow them to move a large army south into New York well before the colonies were ready to resist it. He assembled a small fleet of gunboats and galleys, built hastily from green timber, crewed partly by soldiers who had never sailed, and confronted the British fleet at the Battle of Valka Island in October 1776. Arnold's fleet was defeated and largely destroyed, but it took time for the British to build their own fleet, and Arnold's resistance consumed additional weeks. By the time the British controlled Lake Champlain, the season was too far advanced to mount a major land campaign into New York before winter. The invasion was postponed to 1777. That postponement mattered enormously to the American cause. It gave Washington and Congress another winter to prepare. Whether Arnold deserves full credit for this delay, or whether other factors, including British organisational challenges and the calendar, would have produced the same result, historians weigh differently. What is clear is that Lake Champlain bought time, and time was what the rebellion most needed. While armies fought on land, the war on water was developing its own shape. The Continental Congress formally authorized a Continental Navy in October 1775, and the first American warships put to sea in early 1776. The Navy would never be large enough to challenge British sea power directly. Britain's Royal Navy was the largest in the world, and nothing the colonies could build or buy would change that strategic reality. But the Navy was not the only American instrument at sea. Congress also authorized privateering, the licensing of private ships to attack British merchant vessels and take their cargoes as prizes. Privateers operated throughout the war, drawing men and capital from coastal communities across New England and beyond. Estimates of total privateering activity are difficult to verify precisely, but the disruption to British shipping was real and cumulative. Insurance rates for British Atlantic commerce rose. Some supplies intended for British forces in North America were intercepted. The psychological and economic effect on British merchants was a continuous pressure even when it did not alter any single military campaign. In London, the debate about how to respond to the American rebellion had produced a decision that would shape the entire war. King George III had issued his proclamation of rebellion in August 1775, formally declaring the colonies in a state of sedition and rejecting the Continental Congress's petitions for reconciliation. Parliament voted to send a substantially larger military force to North America in 1776, including German auxiliary troops provided under treaties with several German states, primarily Hesse-Kassel. These soldiers were not mercenaries in the sense of stateless military professionals. They served under their own officers in organised formations and fought as part of the British military structure. But their service was contracted by their rulers for financial payment, and contemporaries on both sides used their presence to argue about the nature of the conflict. The arrival of German auxiliary troops confirmed what the more perceptive observers had understood since Lexington. This would not be a brief colonial disturbance settled by a show of force. It would be a real war, expensive and uncertain in its outcome, and it was about to become something more. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was moving toward the step that no petition had managed to achieve and no battle had yet made inevitable, a Declaration of Independence. When that declaration came, in July 1776, it would change what the war was about without changing the military balance that still heavily favoured Britain. Independence and the battle for New York. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, it approved the final text of the Declaration. Neither date immediately altered the movement of British ships or the position of British soldiers, but both dates changed the nature of the conflict in ways that would matter for years to come. The Declaration was a political document with a military function. It told the world, particularly France, that the colonies were not seeking a return to the old relationship with Britain. They were claiming sovereignty. They were open to foreign alliance as an independent state, not merely as rebellious subjects seeking foreign support. The Declaration ended the possibility of a negotiated return to the pre-1775 arrangement, at least while it had force. It committed the independence movement publicly and formally to winning or losing everything. Thomas Jefferson drafted the text. Congress edited it substantially, removing a passage attacking the slave trade that several delegations would not accept. What survived was a document that grounded its political claim in natural rights, that all men were created equal, that they possessed rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were powerful ideas, and they carried a tension that would pursue the new nation for generations. A republic founded on equality was also a republic in which the labour of enslaved people built the wealth of its most prominent founders. Washington had the Declaration read aloud to his assembled troops in New York on July 9th, 1776. His army was already in position defending New York City, and he was already watching the horizon for the British fleet that intelligence told him was coming. The Declaration gave the soldiers something to fight for that was larger than any petition. It also told them plainly that there was no longer a diplomatic solution waiting to be reached. They would win independence, or they would face the consequences of a failed rebellion. What arrived off Staten Island in the weeks that followed was the largest military force Britain had ever assembled in North America. General William Howe commanded the land forces, ultimately around 32,000 troops, including British regulars and German auxiliaries, well supplied, professionally led, and experienced. His brother Admiral Richard Howe commanded the fleet. Together, the Howe brothers represented both British military authority and a peace commission. They had instructions to offer pardon to colonists who returned to allegiance. They expected that military pressure would do what political argument had not, producing a negotiated end to the rebellion. Washington had fewer than 20,000 men available to defend New York, many of them militia without consistent training, most of them untested in the kind of a large-scale set-piece battle that the British Army excelled at. He tried to defend both Manhattan and Long Island simultaneously, spreading his forces across a wide defensive arc. The geography of New York, with its multiple rivers, harbours and islands, gave the British enormous advantages. Their fleet could land troops almost anywhere, opening flanks and cutting off defenders before they could respond. On August 22nd, 1776, British and German forces landed on Long Island in large numbers. Washington reinforced his defensive positions, anchoring them on the high ground of Brooklyn Heights. The American line stretched across a ridge, with passes through the wooded hills guarded by militia units. The attack came on August 27th. Howe sent forces to press the American centre, while a large column under General Henry Clinton made a night march through the Jamaica Pass, a route on the American far left that had been left inadequately guarded. By morning, the British were behind Washington's right flank. The battle became a catastrophe. Thousands of American soldiers were trapped or killed trying to reach the Brooklyn perimeter. 2 brigades from Maryland and Delaware fought desperate rearguard actions that bought time for other units to retreat at severe cost to themselves. The British and German troops who had outflanked the American position closed in on the survivors from multiple directions. The Brooklyn perimeter held, but barely, and everyone on both sides understood it could not hold long. Howe chose not to assault the fortifications directly, perhaps remembering the cost of Breed's Hill, and settled in to besiege them. Washington recognized the trap, and on the night of August 29th he authorized the evacuation that began this story. 9,000 men crossing the East River in the darkness, boats moving through fog, an army escaping the destruction that should have ended the rebellion before July's ink was dry. The weeks that followed were a sustained retreat. Washington abandoned New York City in mid-September. British forces landed above his position and nearly cut off his escape. A brief American success at Harlem Heights, where a sharp engagement turned back a British probe and boosted morale for a day, could not change the strategic situation. The army continued to lose ground. Fort Washington, a Continental fortification on the northern end of Manhattan, fell in November with close to 3,000 men captured. Fort Lee, across the Hudson River in New Jersey, was abandoned in such haste that tents, supplies, and cannon were left behind. By late November, Washington was leading a shrinking army through the cold fields of New Jersey, with British and German forces under General Charles Cornwallis pressing steadily behind him. The civilian experience of these weeks illustrates a complexity the military record alone cannot capture. The revolution in communities where neighbours held different loyalties was as much a social contest as a military one. The British proclamation of pardon, offering amnesty to anyone who swore allegiance to the Crown, produced genuine responses in New Jersey in the fall of 1776. People who had watched the Continental Army retreat for weeks, who had seen the militia dissolve, and who were being asked by patriot committees to give money and supplies to a cause that seemed to be losing, took the oaths in significant numbers. Some did so because they genuinely preferred British rule. Some did so because the British Army was present and the Continental Army was not, and survival required accommodation. Some took the oath and quietly resumed supporting the Patriot side as soon as British forces moved elsewhere. This pattern of civilian populations calculating their options based on which armed force was actually present repeated itself throughout the war in every theatre. Loyalists in New Jersey, who had kept quiet while Patriot authority was dominant, began to emerge. Some provided intelligence to the British. The proclamation of pardon seemed to be working. If the British could apply enough military pressure, the civilian population might simply abandon the independence movement and return to the Crown's protection. Thomas Paine was with the retreating army in those November weeks. He wrote on a drumhead by firelight, and what he produced was read aloud in camps and printed in newspapers across the country. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote in the first of his American Crisis pamphlets. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." The words circulated through a movement that needed them, but words could not repair enlistments. As December approached, Washington's effective force had shrunk to somewhere around 3,000 men fit for duty. His army was crossing the Delaware River into Pennsylvania to prevent being caught and destroyed in the open. The Continental Congress, fearing that Philadelphia might fall, relocated to Baltimore. A delegate from Pennsylvania, who'd been among the Declaration's signers, wrote privately that if something dramatic did not happen soon, the game would be nearly over. Washington had crossed the Delaware. He had preserved the army, but he had run out of ground to retreat across. If the rebellion was to survive, something had to change in the next few weeks, and the change, when it came, would arrive across the same river where the army had been trying to disappear. The 10 days that saved the cause. The Delaware River in late December 1776 was full of ice. Large floes moved with the current, grinding against each other in the cold. The river was not frozen solid. It rarely was at Trenton, but it was dangerous, unpredictable, and deeply unpleasant to cross in the dark. Washington looked at it and decided to cross it anyway. He had spent weeks gathering what he needed. Boats, primarily Durham boats, wide-bottom cargo vessels used to haul iron and grain on the Delaware, had been collected over a stretch of the river and hidden from British observation. His men had been told to hold their cartridges dry and carry 3 days of cooked rations. The password for the operation was Victoria. The countersign was an old Latin phrase meaning liberty. The crossing began on Christmas night, December 25th, 1776, in deteriorating weather. What had been cold rain turned to sleet and then snow. The wind rose. Artillery, including cannon under the supervision of Henry Knox, had to be loaded into the boats and managed across the moving ice. The operation that Washington hoped would put his forces on the New Jersey side by midnight took until nearly 4 in the morning. 2 other crossings planned for the same night, at different points downriver, failed entirely. The ice and the weather were too severe. Washington now faced a choice he had not anticipated. His timetable had slipped by hours. His flanking support would not arrive. If he continued, he would be attacking Trenton in daylight, not before dawn as planned. He ordered the march to continue. The force that moved through the pre-dawn darkness numbered around 2,400 men. They marched 9 miles through snow with numb feet. Some wore rags wrapped around their feet in place of shoes that had worn through. The artillery, perhaps 18 cannon, was pulled along roads that turned slippery with ice. Officers kept the men moving by riding down the column, pushing those who slowed, keeping formation together. The German auxiliaries stationed at Trenton had been on heightened alert through much of December, but the steady harassment of their outposts and the terrible weather of Christmas night had not produced a general attack. The garrison commander, Colonel Johann Rell, had received a note that morning warning him of American activity, but the note reportedly remained unread in his pocket. The Trenton garrison was not drunk. The popular tradition of a Hessian force celebrating Christmas into insensibility is not supported by the most reliable evidence, but it was not expecting a coordinated attack from a direction the ice had seemed to make impassable. The Americans arrived at the edge of Trenton from 2 directions at roughly 8 o'clock in the morning. Knox's artillery moved quickly to commanding positions at the heads of the town's main streets. When the German troops tried to form for a counterattack, American guns swept their positions with grape shot. The street fighting that followed was brief and one-sided. Rall was mortally wounded trying to rally his men in an orchard at the edge of town. Within an hour, close to 900 German soldiers had surrendered. Washington had lost no men killed in combat, though 2 soldiers had frozen to death on the march. Washington took his prisoners and his captured supplies back across the Delaware. A few days later, he crossed again, positioned at Trenton, and manoeuvred to avoid a converging British force. On the night of January 2nd, 1777, he left his campfires burning, slipped around the British left flank in darkness, and arrived at Princeton in the morning. A sharp engagement at Princeton produced another American victory. British reinforcements were moving fast, and Washington did not wait for them. He moved his army into winter quarters in the hills around Morristown, New Jersey, where the terrain made pursuit difficult and the army could recover. what had Trenton and Princeton actually accomplished? They had not expelled the British from New Jersey. They had not resolved the enlistment crisis, the supply problems, or the wider strategic situation. Many of the men who had crossed the Delaware were serving their last days before going home. The British still held New York City and most of the surrounding territory. Philadelphia remained threatened. But the effect on morale, on the spirit of the independence movement, was immediate and measurable. The Continental Congress, which had been nervously discussing whether to move further from Philadelphia, returned to the city. State governments that had gone quiet resumed organizing. Enlistment drives that had seemed hopeless produced more results than they might have without the news from Trenton. Washington's correspondence in January and February 1777 still reveals a commander worried about supply, personnel, and the structural weakness of his army. But the tone of the letters from Congress had changed. The cause had survived its worst weeks, and people who'd been watching to see which way things went were still watching, and had not yet given up. The German troops who had surrendered at Trenton were people too, and it is worth remembering them as such. Many had not chosen military service freely. They had been provided to the British under treaties with their princes. Some who were prisoners of the Continental Army eventually chose to remain in North America rather than return to Germany. Some settled in Pennsylvania and other states after the war. Their experience of the Revolution was not the same as anyone else's, not as British officers, not as American patriots, not as Loyalist civilians. And the story of the Revolution becomes more honest when it includes their presence as full human participants, rather than simply as obstacles that Washington removed. The 10 days between Christmas and the operation at Princeton had not won the war, but they had prevented the war from being lost, and that, in the winter of 1776 and 1777, was enough to carry the cause to spring, the year of two campaigns. The summer of 1777 was the year Britain tried to end the war with two coordinated strokes and failed at both. The British strategic plan, as it developed in London, and was communicated imperfectly to commanders in the field, had two main components. General Howe would take his army south from New York to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital. General John Burgoyne would lead a separate army south from Canada along the Lake Champlain corridor toward Albany, New York, while a third force moved east through the Mohawk Valley to meet him. If the movements connected, the result would be effective isolation of New England from the middle and southern colonies, severing the rebellion's most radical region from the rest. The plan required coordination that the Atlantic Ocean made difficult. Howe's intentions were not clearly communicated or understood in London. Burgoyne's plan won approval in London, but did not account realistically for the supply challenges of moving an army through dense wilderness, or for the degree of American resistance he would encounter along the way. The two wings of the operation would not, in the end, support each other. Howe moved his army by sea, landing on the Chesapeake Bay and approaching Philadelphia from the south. Washington tried to block him at Brandywine Creek on September 11th, 1777, in a battle that echoed the Long Island disaster. The British found an unguarded ford upstream, marched around Washington's right flank and crumpled the American position. Washington retreated. 3 weeks later, after a night attack at Germantown on October 4th failed to retake the initiative, the Americans came close before fog, friendly fire and organizational breakdown cost them the momentum. The Continental Army withdrew to winter quarters, and Philadelphia fell to the British. Howe occupied Philadelphia. The Continental Congress moved again, this time to York, Pennsylvania. Washington's army was in the field, unbroken but battered, and his critics in Congress were beginning to compare his record unfavorably to what was happening 300 miles north. What was happening north was a British catastrophe. Burgoyne's army, about 7,000 British and German regulars plus Canadian and Native American auxiliaries, had moved south from Canada in the summer with considerable initial success. Fort Ticonderoga fell to the British in early July, a shock to American expectations. But the advance slowed almost immediately. The American forces under General Philip Schuyler and then Horatio Gates felled trees across roads, broke dams to flood low ground, and made movement through the wilderness as painful as possible. Supply became Burgoyne's central problem. His army was operating far from its base at the end of a long and fragile line. At Oriskany in August 1777, a relief force marching to the Mohawk Valley suffered severe casualties in an ambush, and the British expedition toward Albany from the west eventually withdrew. At Bennington, a British foraging expedition sent to seize supplies from Vermont was destroyed by militia under John Stark. Burgoyne's army was losing men it could not replace and supplies it could not recover, while the American forces gathering to oppose it were growing. The battle at Saratoga, which unfolded over two major engagements in September and October 1777, was the result. The first engagement on September 19th at Freeman's Farm was tactically inconclusive but costly for the British. The second, on October 7th at Bemis Heights, was an American victory in which the British attack was repulsed and Burgoyne's position became untenable. Benedict Arnold played a significant combat role in the second engagement, leading troops forward at a critical moment, reportedly after being relieved of command by Gates in a quarrel, though the precise credit for American success belongs to many commanders, including Daniel Morgan's riflemen, who targeted British officers with devastating precision, and the American fortifications and artillery that controlled the field. Burgoyne, surrounded, his supplies almost gone, retreated to Saratoga. On October 17th, 1777, he surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men to Horatio Gates. The surrender at Saratoga was the largest British capitulation in a century. It was not the end of the war. Howe still held Philadelphia. The Continental Army was still fragile and the British still controlled New York. But it was something the Continental cause had desperately needed, an undeniable victory, visible to the world at a moment when France was watching carefully. The native nations involved in the 1777 campaigns had their own stakes and made their own decisions. Among the Haudenosaunee, the great confederacy of nations stretching through New York, the alliance held by the Revolution fractured painfully. The Mohawk, led in part by the remarkable Joseph Brant, known in his own language as Thayendanegea, a man of considerable education who travelled to London and understood both worlds with unusual clarity, sided primarily with Britain, as did the Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. The Oneida and Tuscarora nations largely supported the American side. Brant understood that the independence movement represented an immediate and existential threat to Haudenosaunee land. American settlers moving west were the pressure that would destroy the Confederacy's territory, regardless of how the war ended. British promises of land protection were not reliable, but they were better than anything the Continental Congress was offering. Brant and his warriors participated in raids on frontier settlements in Pennsylvania and New York during 1778 that were devastating to those communities and created lasting bitterness. The war on the frontier was in many places a war of reprisal and counter-reprisal between neighbours who had lived alongside each other before the conflict forced a choice. The Oneida chose differently. Their reasons were complex: relationships with the missionary and educator Samuel Kirkland, local political considerations, and an assessment that American victory was more compatible with their survival. Oneida warriors fought at Oriskany, contributed to the intelligence and scouting that supported American operations, and paid a serious price for their choice when Haudenosaunee unity shattered and raids struck their own communities. The war divided the Haudenosaunee in ways that would not be repaired after it ended. These decisions by native nations were not simply choices about which Europeans to support. They were choices about territorial survival, diplomatic leverage, and the uncertain future of communities whose land both sides were willing to consume as the price of winning. What Saratoga meant, above all else, was that France would now seriously consider entering the war. Alliance and Valley Forge. France had been watching the American rebellion since it began, and providing covert support since before the declaration was signed. The French government under King Louis XVI and his foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, saw in the American revolt an opportunity that had nothing to do with political sympathy for Republican government. France had lost Canada and much of its Atlantic empire to Britain in the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. The American rebellion was a chance to weaken Britain, recover lost prestige, and potentially reclaim influence in the Atlantic world. If the American colonies could be separated from Britain, the British Empire would be materially diminished. That was the strategic logic France was acting on. Covert French aid had been flowing to the Continental Congress through a fictitious trading company established in 1776 at Vergennes' direction. Gunpowder, clothing, muskets, and cannon had crossed the Atlantic before any formal alliance existed. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman of considerable means and idealism, had sailed to America in 1777 on his own initiative, joined the Continental Army, and established a direct personal relationship with Washington. He would serve as a living link between the American cause and the French court. The American victory at Saratoga reached Paris in December 1777. It demonstrated what French officials had been uncertain about, that the Continental Army could win major engagements and was not about to collapse. Vergennes argued that France should formalize its support before Britain could offer the Americans enough concessions to end the rebellion and reunify the empire. Benjamin Franklin, who had been in Paris as an American diplomatic representative since late 1776, worked skillfully to make the case for alliance. His presence was a public spectacle in itself. The famous philosopher and scientist in his fur cap, received by French aristocrats and intellectuals who found him the embodiment of a certain romantic idea of American simplicity and wisdom. The treaties came in February 1778. France formally recognized American independence and signed treaties of amity, commerce, and alliance with the United States. The military terms committed France to fighting until American independence was secure. No separate peace would be made with Britain. Spain and the Dutch Republic would eventually follow France into the conflict, creating a war that stretched British military and naval resources across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and beyond. What had been a colonial rebellion became a global war. None of this was visible to the men at Valley Forge. Washington had moved his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in December 1777, on a plateau about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The location was defensible and relatively central, but the army arrived in a condition of serious privation. Clothing was inadequate, shoes had worn through. The supply system that should have kept the army fed and equipped had broken down, partly through administrative failure, and partly through the simple difficulty of procuring and transporting goods in wartime. Washington's general orders during that winter document shortages that went beyond discomfort. There were periods when portions of the army had nothing to eat for days at a time. Disease was a greater killer than British arms during the Valley Forge winter. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia moved through the crowded log huts that soldiers built for shelter. Estimates of deaths at Valley Forge range from approximately 2,000 to 2,500 men, though precise figures are uncertain. Horses died in large numbers as well, which compounded the army's transportation problems. Valley Forge has accumulated a mythology in American memory that deserves some careful handling. It was a terrible winter, and the suffering was real. But it was not necessarily the worst winter of the war, and the transformation it is said to have produced did not happen in one season through one person's intervention. Conditions at Morristown in the winter of 1779 and 1780 were by some accounts more severe. The organisational reforms of 1778 were the result of many actors, not one. Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778, bearing letters of introduction that described him as a general in the Prussian service. His actual rank had been somewhat embellished in those letters, but his understanding of military training and organisation was genuine and rare. He spoke almost no English. He communicated through translators, chiefly a French-speaking aide who rendered his German into French and then into English through a chain of officers. Despite this obstacle, or perhaps, as some have suggested, because of the unintentional comedy it created which made him approachable, von Steuben became effective. He standardized the manual of arms, the precise sequence of movements for loading, firing and maneuvering with a musket. He trained a model company and sent its members out as instructors to other units. He insisted on consistent drill across the entire army, replacing the variety of different traditions that different regiments had brought from their different states. He also worked on the basic organisation of military camps, sanitation, supply distribution, the position of latrines relative to kitchens, improvements that had direct effects on the disease rate. What von Steuben did, along with reforms pushed through by Nathaniel Greene as the new Quartermaster General, was give the army institutional structure that could survive the rotation of individual soldiers. An army that depends entirely on the courage and endurance of individual men fighting on spirit alone is fragile. An army with standard procedures, reliable logistics and shared training has a durability that outlasts any single crisis. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, following the news that the British were evacuating Philadelphia, it was a different force, not perfect, not equal to the British Army in every category, but disciplined enough to stand in line under fire, organised enough to manoeuvre, and coherent enough to function as an army rather than as a collection of individual units fighting independently. The Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778 showed the difference. The Continental Army engaged the British rearguard in intense summer heat. Temperatures reportedly reached nearly 100 degrees, and fought a sustained engagement that ended in a tactical draw, but a strategic American result. The British retreated to New York, where they would remain for years. Washington had stabilized his army's position. The war was entering a new phase, but it was not ending, and its center of gravity was about to move. A war beyond the main army, the war that Washington and Howe fought in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, was only one of the wars being conducted simultaneously across the continent and the sea. Far from the main camps, on coastal waters and in the Atlantic, privateers flying American commissions were attacking British merchant shipping in quantities that caused genuine economic concern in Britain. Privateering attracted sailors, investors, and captains who saw opportunity in the disruption of trade, and the volume of British merchant losses, while difficult to quantify precisely, was substantial enough to drive up maritime insurance rates significantly and to motivate British convoy arrangements that diverted naval resources. The Continental Navy also produced occasional striking moments. John Paul Jones's capture of the British warship Serapis in September 1779 was a naval engagement that produced no direct strategic effect, but enormous propaganda value in Europe. Closer to the American settled territories, the frontier was a zone of nearly continuous violence. British Allied native forces raided settlements along the northern frontier of Pennsylvania and New York in 1778 and 1779, striking communities like Wyoming and Cherry Valley with devastating effect on civilian populations. These raids were military operations with military objectives: to drain American resources, terrorize settlers, and keep Continental forces occupied away from the main theaters. The violence was real, and the suffering was severe, and it created grievances and retaliations that did not end when the British signed a treaty. Congress authorized a punitive expedition against the Haudenosaunee nations that had participated in frontier raids. The Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779 moved through the heart of Iroquois country in New York, destroying towns, burning crops, and demolishing the agricultural infrastructure on which communities depended. The campaign displaced large numbers of people and produced suffering on a significant scale. It did not break the military alliance between the Haudenosaunee and Britain, and it did not secure the frontier, but it changed the Haudenosaunee world permanently, destroying communities that had existed for generations and forcing thousands of people into refugee dependence on British support. The war along the frontier was among the most complete social catastrophes of the Revolutionary period, and its effects on native communities far outlasted any political settlement. The question of Black Americans and the war presents a similar complexity. Tens of thousands of enslaved people saw the conflict as an opportunity, and they moved toward it with the resourcefulness available to them. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved men who belonged to rebel owners and who escaped to British lines and served in British forces. The offer was limited. It did not apply to enslaved people owned by Loyalists, and the British were not always in a position to guarantee what they promised. But tens of thousands of enslaved people made the attempt nonetheless, accepting enormous risks of recapture, disease in British camps, and an uncertain future, because the alternative was continued bondage. Those who reached British lines were not uniformly well treated. Some were put to work in military labour rather than taken on as soldiers. Disease in British camps, particularly smallpox, killed many who had survived the escape. When the war ended, British commanders honoured their commitment imperfectly. Some black loyalists were evacuated, some were left behind, and some who had been evacuated were subsequently re-enslaved by British officers in violation of their legal status. On the Patriot side, free black men served in the Continental Army from its early days, and the complex evolution of enlistment policy gradually expanded their role. Rhode Island organised an entire battalion with a large proportion of black soldiers, including some who had been promised freedom in exchange for their service. Some enslaved men served with their master's permission. Some ran to the Continental forces as a path to freedom, and the outcomes for individuals varied considerably depending on the state, the commander, and the specific circumstances. Black soldiers fought at many of the war's major engagements, from the early campaigns in New England through the battles of the mid-Atlantic states and into the Southern theatre. The story of Boston King, a South Carolinian who escaped enslavement and eventually reached British lines, illustrates some of these tensions. King served with British forces, endured serious illness, was briefly re-enslaved by an American soldier, and eventually made it to the British evacuation at the war's end, travelling to Nova Scotia and later to Sierra Leone. His later memoir provides evidence of what the experience of being a black loyalist during the Revolution actually involved. Not liberation into comfort, but a difficult transit through a war that had not been designed with black freedom as its central aim, pursued by a person who used every possible avenue to secure a life on terms better than enslavement. Women's contributions to the Revolution extended far beyond the homes and farms where most of them spent the war. Camp followers were an organised feature of military life. The Continental Army issued daily rations to women attached to units, regulated their presence, and relied on their labour for nursing, cooking and laundering. Washington's general orders addressed camp women regularly, treating their presence as a necessary part of military organisation rather than a tolerated inconvenience. Margaret Corbin was among those who experienced the war directly in combat circumstances. At Fort Washington in November 1776, she was with her husband at his cannon when he was killed. She took over the gun, was herself severely wounded, and received a military pension from the Continental Congress, an acknowledgement, however limited, of her service. The wider tradition that clusters around the figure of Molly Pitcher, a woman bringing water to soldiers and taking over a gun at Monmouth, reflects authentic documented practices even if the specific story as often told combines elements from multiple people and later tradition. Women were present in those circumstances. The details of any individual account require careful sourcing. At home, women managed farms, businesses and households in the absence of husbands and fathers. They made decisions about creditors, crops, property, and politics that would have been legally constrained before the war. They organised boycotts of British goods. The so-called homespun movement was substantially organised and sustained by women. They made and repaired clothing for soldiers. Some wrote political correspondence that contributed to the public debate about the revolution's meaning. The war changed what women did without immediately changing what women were permitted to do in law or politics, creating a gap between expanded practice and unchanged formal status that would take generations to begin to close. The Loyalists, those who remained attached to the crown, were not one group. They included wealthy merchants and planters who feared that the independence movement threatened the property arrangements that sustained them. They included recent immigrants who felt loyalty to the country they had left. They included members of religious communities, particularly some Anglican congregations, whose ties to the established church aligned them with Crown authority. They included people who had been harassed or coerced by patriot committees, and whose opposition to independence was inseparable from their resentment of that coercion. They included people who simply believed that the colonies were better off inside the British Empire than outside it, and that the risks of independence outweighed the grievances that drove it. Loyalist civilians experienced the revolution from the inside. Some were driven from their homes. Some had their property confiscated by state governments. Some were tarred and feathered or subjected to other forms of violence. Some fled to British-controlled areas, to Canada, to the Caribbean, or back to Britain. Their number is difficult to estimate precisely. Suggestions have ranged widely among historians, but there were enough of them that their presence shaped every community's wartime experience, and their political fate would be a central issue in the peace negotiations still years away. The war had become something the original Lexington militiamen could not have imagined. A global conflict involving multiple European powers, a civil war between neighbours, a scramble for native land and sovereignty, and a crucible in which the contradiction between liberty and slavery was being tested by the people it affected most directly. The war moves South Britain had spent 3 years trying to end the rebellion in the north. The Continental Army had survived at Boston, survived New York, survived the Pennsylvania campaign, and refused to dissolve. The French alliance had changed the strategic equation in ways that were still working out in 1778 and 1779. British commanders were beginning to understand that holding a city, even a large city like Philadelphia or New York, did not translate into controlling the territory around it, and that the territory was where the war would actually be won or lost. In 1778, British strategy shifted. The new approach would emphasise the southern colonies, where Loyalist populations were believed to be larger and more willing to take up arms, where the geography offered coastal access via a powerful fleet, and where the slave population created a security concern for patriot planters that might make military resistance harder to sustain. If the British could pacify South Carolina and Georgia, they reasoned, they could extend control northward and force the northern colonies into a settlement. The opening moves were encouraging for Britain. Savannah, Georgia, fell to a British amphibious assault in December 1778. Augusta followed. A French and American attempt to retake Savannah in 1779 failed with significant casualties. Georgia was effectively under British control. The hammer blow came at Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1780. General Henry Clinton, who had replaced Howe as British commander, brought a large force by sea and laid siege to the city. General Benjamin Lincoln, commanding the American forces inside Charleston, had made the difficult decision to defend the city rather than abandon it, partly because Congress and the state government pressured him not to surrender the most important city in the South. In May 1780, after a siege of several weeks, Lincoln surrendered. More than 5,000 Continental soldiers and militia went into captivity. It was the largest American surrender of the entire war. The Continental Army's southern presence had been effectively destroyed. The way to the interior seemed open. British forces spread across South Carolina, establishing posts throughout the backcountry and inviting Loyalist civilians to form local militia units. The southern strategy seemed to be working exactly as its architects had intended, but controlling territory in the south turned out to require something the British had not fully reckoned with: the ability to remain in every place simultaneously while facing opposition that refused to accept that the war was over. The southern backcountry was already a zone of intense political conflict before the British arrived. The revolution in the Carolinas and Georgia was as much a civil war between Patriot and Loyalist neighbours as it was a struggle against British authority. Communities are divided along lines of ethnicity, religion, economic interest, and personal animosity that predated the rebellion. When British forces arrived with promises of protection and invitations to take arms against the Patriots, some communities responded. When they departed, as they inevitably did because they could not be everywhere, those communities were left exposed to Patriot retribution. Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, was sent south to rebuild American forces and challenge the British. He moved too quickly, with too little information and too much confidence, and on August 16, 1780, at Camden, South Carolina, his army met Lord Cornwallis in open battle. The result was catastrophic. The militia on Gates's flanks fled almost immediately under British bayonet pressure. The Continental regulars in the centre, outnumbered and exposed, were badly beaten. Gates himself rode from the battlefield at considerable speed, covering more than 60 miles before stopping, an inglorious performance that ended his military reputation permanently. Cornwallis held the field. American forces in the south had been beaten twice. The backcountry Patriot communities were under severe pressure from Loyalist militia and British cavalry raids under Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, who moved aggressively and quickly, and whose force had been accused after an earlier engagement of killing surrendering soldiers, an accusation that inflamed Patriot sentiment and made Tarleton's quarter a byword for British ruthlessness across the southern states. But even as British control seemed most complete, resistance was organising in forms that formal armies could not easily defeat. At Kings Mountain in October 1780, a force of Patriot backcountry militia, mostly from the communities of the Appalachian foothills, men who had organised without Continental authority, surrounded and destroyed a Loyalist militia force under a British officer on a ridge in South Carolina. The fight lasted about an hour. The Loyalist force was almost entirely killed or captured. Kings Mountain did not change the military balance in any large sense, but it demonstrated that British control of the backcountry required continuous armed presence, and that Loyalist forces fighting on Britain's behalf could be overwhelmed when the British regulars were not there to support them. At Cowpens in January 1781, Daniel Morgan demonstrated something about the deployment of militia that most Continental commanders had not managed to replicate. Rather than depending on militia to stand in line of battle against British regulars, which they reliably failed to do, Morgan positioned them in advance of his Continental regulars and gave them a specific, limited task: fire 2 aimed volleys and then fall back around the Continental flank. When Tarleton's force attacked, the militia did exactly what they had been asked. The Continental regulars and militia cavalry then closed the trap. Tarleton's force was almost completely destroyed as a fighting unit, and Tarleton escaped with a small cavalry remnant. Cowpens was a tactical masterpiece. Nathaniel Greene had by then taken command of the Southern Army, replacing Gates. Greene was Washington's most capable subordinate, a Rhode Island Quaker who had overcome his religious community's pacifism to become a brilliant military administrator and strategist. He understood that he did not need to win every engagement. He needed to make British success expensive, stretch Cornwallis's supply lines, keep an American force in the field, and let the logistical and political costs of occupying the South do what battlefield defeats could not. After Cowpens, Cornwallis pursued Greene northward through the Carolinas in what became known as the Race to the Dan River. Greene pulled his army north faster than Cornwallis could follow, crossing into Virginia and leaving Cornwallis in North Carolina without the supplies he needed to continue. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Greene turned, offered battle, fought a fierce engagement, and then withdrew in good order. Cornwallis held the field but had taken severe casualties, roughly a quarter of his force. He could not replace those men easily. The British were winning battles. They were not winning the South. Cornwallis made a decision that would eventually produce Yorktown. Frustrated with the logistics and the resistance in the Carolinas, unable to secure the territory he had conquered, he decided to move into Virginia, where he believed more decisive results were possible, and where he could be supported by sea. He marched north in the spring of 1781, leaving the Carolinas largely in Greene's hands. Greene would continue fighting in the south after Cornwallis left. He won no major victories, but pushed British forces steadily back toward the coast. By late 1781, the British held Savannah and Charleston, coastal cities they had taken 2 years earlier, and almost nothing else. The Southern strategy had failed to produce the Loyalist uprising it depended on, failed to pacify the backcountry, and left Cornwallis marching toward a destination that was about to become the most significant battlefield of the entire war. The road to Yorktown. Cornwallis entered Virginia in the spring of 1781, expecting to find a weakly defended province where decisive operations might succeed where the Carolinas had not. He found instead a Continental force under the Marquis de Lafayette, a 23-year-old French general whose personal relationship with Washington gave him unusual authority, and whose combination of energy, political intelligence, and tactical patience made him a difficult opponent. Lafayette had arrived in America in 1777 at his own expense, motivated by a mixture of idealism, ambition, and the French aristocratic culture that romanticized military adventure. Washington had taken to him almost immediately, treating him with a warmth the reserved general extended to very few people. Lafayette's value was not purely military. He was also a walking symbol of French commitment to the American cause, a reminder at every level of alliance that France had staked its prestige on American success. In Virginia in 1781, Lafayette's immediate problem was that he did not have enough men. Cornwallis commanded more than 7,000 troops, supported by cavalry under Tarleton that raided deep into the Virginia interior. Lafayette had perhaps 3,000 Continental regulars and militia, and he understood that his primary task was not to defeat Cornwallis in open battle, but to keep an American force in the field and avoid the kind of catastrophic defeat that had destroyed the Southern Army twice before. He did this with considerable skill. He avoided battle when Cornwallis had the advantage. He moved quickly enough to avoid being caught. He accepted that Cornwallis would raid widely. The British cavalry reached Charlottesville and nearly captured the Virginia legislature and Governor Thomas Jefferson, but he never allowed his army to be destroyed. Cornwallis wrote letters home complaining about being outmaneuvered by a boy, which was not entirely accurate but captured his frustration. During this manoeuvring, a man named James Armistead was performing one of the most important intelligence services of the war. Armistead was enslaved, the property of a Virginia planter named William Armistead. He had approached Lafayette and volunteered to work as a spy. Lafayette sent him into the British camp, where he posed as a runaway slave seeking British protection. He was given work by the British, possibly even used as an informant within the British information network, which added a layer of operational complexity to his situation, while systematically observing British strength, positions and plans and reporting them to Lafayette. The exact intelligence Armistead provided and its specific effect on the Yorktown campaign are questions that historians have examined carefully, and the evidence supports his service as a genuine intelligence asset, without requiring claims that any single report decided any single battle. What is documented is that Lafayette later testified to his value, that Armistead's information shaped Lafayette's understanding of Cornwallis's dispositions, and that after the war, when James Armistead sought freedom, Lafayette wrote on his behalf. The Virginia legislature emancipated him in 1787. He took the surname Lafayette in honor of the general he had served. His full name, James Armistead Lafayette, encodes in those two surnames the full ambiguity of his position. A man who served a cause of liberty while enslaved, and who received his freedom years after the war he helped win. Cornwallis eventually received orders to establish a defensive position on the Chesapeake coast, where his army could be supported or evacuated by the British Navy. He chose Yorktown, a tobacco shipping port on the York River with reasonable water depth for naval access. His army began constructing fortifications there in the summer of 1781. The sequence of events that turned Yorktown from a British defensive position into a trap required coordination across two continents and an ocean. Washington had been watching the strategic situation throughout the summer of 1781, corresponding with the Comte de Rochambeau, the French commander whose army had been stationed in Rhode Island since 1780. Rochambeau was an experienced professional soldier, 56 years old, courteous in his dealings with Washington, and sophisticated about the limitations of the alliance. He had received word that a large French fleet under Admiral the Comte de Grasse was operating in the Caribbean and might be available for an operation on the North American coast. Washington's preference through much of the summer was for a combined operation against New York. Rochambeau's preference was for Virginia. The French Navy's arrival in American waters would be brief. De Grasse could not remain indefinitely in the North Atlantic, and Rochambeau believed a Virginia campaign offered better prospects of decisive results. The correspondence between Washington and Rochambeau in the summer of 1781 shows two commanders feeling their way toward agreement. De Grasse's letter, which arrived in mid-August, resolved the question. He was bringing 28 ships of the line and 3,000 troops to the Chesapeake Bay. He would be available from late August until mid-October. After that, he needed to return to the Caribbean. If an operation in Virginia was to happen, it had to happen now. Washington made the decision. He would march south. The movement of the combined Franco-American army from the Hudson River Valley to the Chesapeake was one of the most complex logistical operations of the entire war. Roughly 7,000 American and 4,000 French soldiers had to travel nearly 400 miles, supplied along a route that passed through several states with different administrative systems. Washington went to some lengths to suggest he was still threatening New York. maintaining camps and asking local governments about buildings and ovens as if for a siege. Whether this genuinely deceived the British commander in New York, Henry Clinton, for a significant length of time remained somewhat debated, but the deception was attempted. Meanwhile, the outcome of the campaign depended entirely on what happened at sea. On September 5, 1781, the British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. De Grasse's French fleet was already there. The Battle of the Chesapeake, sometimes called the Battle of the Capes, lasted about 2.5 hours of active fighting. It was not a decisive tactical victory for either side in terms of ships destroyed or captured, but its strategic consequence was total. After the engagement, the two fleets lay at sea for several days, neither willing to press a disadvantaged engagement. Then the British fleet returned to New York for repairs. De Grasse returned to the Chesapeake. When the French fleet sailed back into the bay, a French squadron that had been stationed at Newport arrived simultaneously with additional siege artillery. The bay was French. Cornwallis's army at Yorktown had no naval relief. The Allied army arrived by sea and overland in the last days of September 1781. Rochambeau's regiments marched in excellent order. Washington's Continentals had covered tremendous distances. Lafayette's force closed the ring from the Virginia interior. By early October, roughly 16,000 American and French troops had surrounded Yorktown's 7,000 British and German defenders. The Yorktown siege followed formal 18th century procedures. Engineers dug parallels, approached trenches running toward the British fortifications. Artillery was positioned in successive lines as the trenches advanced. The British were bombarded continuously. Two key defensive positions, called Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, guarded the British right flank and had to be taken by assault before the siege lines could be completed. On the night of October 14th, American forces assaulted Redoubt 10, and French forces assaulted Redoubt 9 simultaneously. The American column, which included light infantry under the direct command of Alexander Hamilton, who had long sought an active combat role and had pressed Washington for the assignment, carried their objective in roughly 10 minutes of fierce close-quarters fighting. The French column took somewhat longer against stronger resistance, but also succeeded. The story that Cornwallis himself presented his sword at the surrender ceremony is not quite accurate, and the ceremony itself was more complicated. On October 19th, 1781, the British and German forces marched out of Yorktown between two long lines of French and American soldiers. Cornwallis did not attend. He reported himself ill and sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to conduct the surrender. O'Hara attempted to present his sword to Rochambeau rather than Washington, possibly an effort to acknowledge the French role, or to avoid the humiliation of surrendering to a former colonial, or both. Rochambeau directed him to Washington. Washington, unwilling to accept the surrender from a subordinate when the British commander was technically present in the town, directed O'Hara to his own second, General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln, who had surrendered Charleston to the British the year before, accepted the sword. The surrender was complete. The band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Nearly 8,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest British capitulation since the one at Saratoga 4 years earlier, and far larger in scale. The question now was what it meant. Victory was not yet peace. The surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781 was not the end of the war. Washington understood this, even as the field was still being cleared of surrendered arms and prisoners. He wrote to Congress with the news and returned almost immediately to the practical problems of his army's condition. His soldiers had not been paid, the Continental treasury was nearly empty, and the enlistment situation that had plagued him since 1775 showed no sign of permanent resolution. The British still held New York City, Charleston, Savannah, and several other positions. The Royal Navy remained a powerful presence in the Atlantic. The British government under Lord North had not yet conceded that the war was unwinnable. Fighting continued in the south, where Nathaniel Greene was still pressing British forces back toward the coast. There were engagements in 1782 as both sides maintained their positions and waited for political decisions to catch up with military reality. What changed at Yorktown was the political will of the British Parliament to continue the war. The news reached London in late November 1781 and produced a crisis in the North government. The war had already become expensive, divisive, and strategically complicated by France's entry and the wider European conflict. Yorktown was not the only theatre where Britain was under pressure. The Caribbean campaigns were consuming naval resources, Gibraltar was under siege by Spanish forces, and British commercial interest was suffering across multiple fronts. The opposition in Parliament, led by figures who had questioned the war from its beginning, pressed for peace. Lord North's government, which had managed to continue despite earlier setbacks, began to come apart. In March 1782, North resigned, and a new government under Lord Rockingham took power with a mandate to find a settlement. Rockingham died in July and was replaced by Lord Shelburne, but the direction of policy had been set. Britain would negotiate. The American peace commissioners, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, were in Paris, formally working alongside French diplomats as their alliance required. But they had reasons to be suspicious of French intentions, and their suspicions were not baseless. France had its own interests in the peace settlement, including concerns about American expansion that might conflict with French allies in the region, and the French were keeping in communication with the British on terms the Americans were not always informed of. Jay in particular pressed for direct negotiations with Britain, separate from the French, which technically violated the alliance agreement. Franklin was more cautious. In the end, the American commissioners negotiated a preliminary agreement with Britain in November 1782, without full French knowledge of the terms until they were concluded. The preliminary articles were ambitious and for the Americans remarkably favourable. Britain recognised American independence. The boundaries of the new nation extended to the Mississippi River in the west, the Great Lakes in the north, and Spanish Florida in the south. Fishing rights off the Newfoundland banks were confirmed. British troops would evacuate American territory. There were provisions, not ultimately enforceable, for the recovery of Loyalist property and the payment of pre-war debts to British creditors. Washington, meanwhile, faced a crisis within his own army. Continental soldiers had been patient through years of inadequate pay, and their patience had limits. In early 1783, with a peace treaty clearly approaching but not yet signed, anonymous letters circulated among the officer corps at Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, New York. The letters, later attributed to Major John Armstrong, a Gates aide, called on officers to reject the authority of Congress and use the Army's power to secure what it was owed. The implications were serious. An army that turned on its government would have made the revolution into something very different from what the Declaration had claimed. Washington assembled his officers on March 15th, 1783. He gave a speech that, by his own later account, he had prepared carefully. It did not immediately work as written. Then he reached into his coat for a letter from Congress and fumbled while trying to read it. He reached for his eyeglasses, recently acquired and not yet widely known to his officers. "Gentlemen," he said, in a phrase that has been reliably attributed to him by contemporary accounts, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey but almost blind in the service of my country." The officers wept. Washington had done what the speech alone could not. He had reminded them of what they had all sacrificed together, and of what a military seizure of government would mean for the republic they had created. The Newburgh conspiracy collapsed. The army remained loyal. It was perhaps the most important non-battle of the entire war. The formal Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. Congress ratified it the following January. The last British troops in the United States evacuated New York City on November 25, 1783, Evacuation Day, as New Yorkers would celebrate it for decades. Washington entered the city that day, returning to the place from which his army had fled in a series of retreats 7 years earlier. He resigned his commission before the Continental Congress in Annapolis on December the 23rd, 1783. The act made a global impression. King George III, informed that Washington intended to resign his command and return to his farm rather than seize permanent power, reportedly said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. Washington did that. The Treaty and the Price of Independence. The Treaty of Paris was a document of extraordinary generosity toward the United States in territorial terms and of stark indifference to people who had fought the war without representation in any of its negotiations. The boundaries the treaty established were striking. The new United States would extend from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the northern border of Spanish Florida. This was territory that Britain had acquired from France in 1763, and that American settlers had been pressing into since before the Revolution. The British commissioners accepted these boundaries partly because they believed commercial ties with a prosperous independent America would serve British interests, and partly because the alternative, a peace arrangement that left extensive territory in dispute, would continue the expense of a war they no longer wished to fund. The native nations who had fought, in many cases for years, on the basis of British promises about their territorial sovereignty, were not represented at the Paris negotiations. They were not signatories to the treaty. The document made no mention of the alliances Britain had maintained with them, no mention of commitments that had been made, no provision for their land rights or their political status. The treaty transferred sovereignty over territory that included native homelands without any acknowledgement that those homelands were occupied by people whose claims antedated any European presence. Joseph Brant, who had fought with consistency and military skill on Britain's behalf through years of frontier warfare, was furious. He felt betrayed. He was right to feel so. The peace that ended the war for everyone else did not end it for the Haudenosaunee or any other native nation, whose relationship with the American Republic would be defined by decades of treaty violation, forced removal, and eventual confinement. The Loyalists fared better in the treaty text and worse in practice. The peace articles included a provision that Congress would earnestly recommend to state legislatures that Loyalist property be restored and that further confiscations cease. But Congress had no power to compel states, and most states did not comply. Loyalists who had served with British forces or who had publicly identified with the Crown found themselves unwelcome in communities that now defined their enemies as traitors. Estimates suggest that between 60 and 80,000 Loyalists eventually left the United States, settling in British Canada, in the Caribbean, in Britain itself. They carried with them skills, capital, and grievances. They created new communities, particularly in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Upper Canada, that bore the stamp of their American origins. Among those who left were approximately 3,000 black Loyalists, who were evacuated from New York City when the British departed in the fall of 1783. Sir Guy Carleton, the British commander, oversaw the evacuation with more care for his black charges than many in his position had shown. He created a Book of Negroes, a register of black people seeking evacuation, including their names, their ages, their appearance, and the name of the person claiming ownership of them, or the basis of their claim to freedom. The register documented thousands of individual decisions and stories, each entry a compressed human biography. a person who had calculated that the risks of the British side were less than the certainty of returning to enslavement. Many of these evacuees went to Nova Scotia. There, they found that land promises were slow to materialize, that white settlers often received better land, and that the free life they had fought for remained constrained in ways that made freedom feel incomplete. Some eventually emigrated to Sierra Leone, a new settlement in West Africa established partly to receive black loyalists seeking a different kind of beginning. Boston King was among them. The distances people travelled, across the Atlantic, away from the land of their birth, seeking something that was never quite promised clearly enough, measured the actual cost of a revolution that had proclaimed liberty but contained it. For enslaved people who had fought on the Patriot side, the outcome was equally unresolved. Some who had been promised freedom received it, and military service in several states was a documented path to emancipation for individual men. But slavery as an institution was strengthened in important ways by the Constitution that followed the peace treaty. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power than the size of their free population warranted. The Constitution's language about fugitive persons required the return of escaped slaves across state lines. The slave trade was protected from congressional interference until 1808. The new republic inherited the Revolution's contradiction between liberty and bondage and built it into the nation's fundamental law. Women who had sustained the Revolution through years of labor, management, sacrifice, and political engagement found themselves in a republic that had not fundamentally revised their legal or political status. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John in 1776, had asked him to remember the ladies in the creation of new legal codes. Her letter was responded to with warmth and what she recognized as a lack of serious intent. The post-war republic did not extend formal political rights to women. The Declaration's claim that all men were created equal was understood by its authors and their political world to mean something very different from universal suffrage or legal equality across the population. The Continental soldiers who had served for years, and in some cases for the entire war, returned home to communities that could not always support them. Pay arrears that had accumulated through the war were eventually settled with land warrants, certificates that could be exchanged for land in the Western Territories. Some veterans found this useful. Others sold the warrants at a fraction of their face value to speculators because they needed cash now, not land later. The pension system was inadequate and contested. Several states were more generous with their veterans than the federal government managed to be. The men who had endured the worst of what Valley Forge, the retreat through New Jersey, and the years of unpaid service represented were often rewarded more in rhetoric than in material support. The republic that emerged from the Revolution was real, legally recognized and territorially substantial, but the price of independence had been paid by many people, in many currencies, some of which were never redeemed. What won the war? Return for a moment to that river. August 1776. Boats in the darkness. 9,000 soldiers crossing the East River in silence, with a fog thickening around them, and the most powerful military force Britain had ever assembled in North America just a few miles away. The independence the Continental Congress had declared 6 weeks earlier seemed, in those hours, unlikely to outlast the summer. That the Revolution did outlast the summer, and then the winter, and then 4 more years of continental and global war, that was not the result of one cause. It was not the result of one battle, one general, one strategic insight, one foreign ally, or one national virtue. It was the result of many things acting together in ways that became decisive only in retrospect. Washington's military leadership is the place most accounts begin, and not without reason. He made serious mistakes. He tried to defend New York with inadequate forces against an enemy that held the initiative. He allowed Fort Washington to be lost when a withdrawal might have saved 3,000 men. His performance at Brandywine echoed the failure at Long Island, a flanking movement around an unguarded position that he should have anticipated. He was not the consistently successful commander that later memory preferred to see. But Washington's contribution to the revolution was not primarily tactical. It was institutional and political. He understood, and this understanding deepened through the New York campaign and the retreat through New Jersey, that the army itself was the cause's most important physical asset. A city could be abandoned and retaken. An army once destroyed could not be quickly rebuilt. From late 1776 onward, he made the preservation of his army the organizing principle of his strategy, accepting tactical defeats when the alternative was tactical risk that might eliminate his force entirely. He also managed over 8 years a relationship with Congress that was consistently fraught but never permanently ruptured. He needed Congress for men, money, and supplies. Congress needed him for legitimacy and for the continued existence of a force that made independence more than a piece of paper. He complained in his letters, sometimes bitterly. He pushed for longer enlistments, better pay, more reliable supply. He didn't get most of what he asked for. He continued to function within civilian authority, understanding that a republic built on the claim that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed could not be founded by a general who had ignored the government that governed him. The Continental soldiers who served, the men who re-enlisted when they could have gone home, who stayed through Valley Forge when deserting was easy, who crossed the Delaware in December cold for a commander who had been retreating for months, contributed something that cannot be quantified as a tactical variable. Joseph Plum Martin, a Connecticut private who served most of the war and wrote about it decades later, recorded experiences of deprivation, exhaustion, humor, and endurance that resist any reduction to strategic analysis. Men like Martin were the physical material that made the strategy possible. Without them, without their patience and their willingness to remain soldiers in conditions that gave them every material reason not to be, there was no army, and without the army there was no independence. The militia's role was different from the Continental armies, and it is important to understand both what the militia did and what it could not do. Militia units could not stand in line against British regulars in sustained battle, and when they were asked to do so, they usually did not. At Camden, Gates discovered this catastrophically, but militia could harass supply lines, deny the British free movement through the countryside, tip off Continental commanders about enemy movements, and make the cost of occupying territory higher than simply holding a few fortified posts. The Southern Campaign in particular demonstrated what militia could do when they were used for tasks they could actually perform. The destruction of a Loyalist militia at Kings Mountain, the two-volley movement at Cowpens, the constant attrition of British logistics throughout the Carolinas. Greene understood this, and his use of irregular forces alongside his Continental regulars was one of the campaign's central strategic features. Geography worked against Britain throughout the war in ways that compounded every other difficulty. The distance between Britain and North America meant that supplies, reinforcements, and orders all travelled at the speed of sailing ships, often taking 6 weeks or more each way. A strategic situation that seemed manageable in London might have deteriorated entirely by the time a response could be delivered and acted on. The sheer size of the American territory meant that capturing cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, did not produce control of the countryside around them. There was always more countryside, there were always more roads, more farms, more communities beyond the range of any garrison. British strategic planning suffered from disagreements that never fully resolved. Some commanders believed that a decisive defeat of Washington's army was the primary objective. Others believed that capturing major cities and restoring civil government would gradually build Loyalist authority. Others believed the Southern strategy would work where the Northern had not. The different approaches were not pursued simultaneously with full commitment, and each time Britain shifted its emphasis, it left unfinished business in the theatre it was leaving. Loyalist support was real but structurally limited. Loyalists could fight when British forces were present to support and protect them. When British forces moved on, Loyalist communities were exposed. The cycle of Patriot raids, Loyalist counter-raids, British arrival, Patriot suppression, and British departure exhausted communities and made sustained Loyalist military organisation almost impossible to maintain. Britain needed a reliable Loyalist militia that could hold territory without constant military support. It never quite found one that could do so. France changed the war's mathematics in ways that made ultimate British success improbable. Before formal French intervention, Britain had to contend with a rebellion in North America. After 1778, Britain faced a global war in which North America was one theatre among several. The Caribbean, where sugar colonies generated enormous wealth, required naval defence. Gibraltar needed holding. The Indian Ocean became another front. British resources that might have been concentrated on destroying the Continental Army had to be spread across commitments that British strategy could not safely abandon. French financial and material support, which had been flowing covertly before 1778 and openly after it, kept the Continental cause alive during periods when American credit and supply were at their worst. The French army that marched with Washington's Continentals to Yorktown was well supplied, professionally organised, and essential to the numerical superiority that made the siege viable. But it was the French navy that made Yorktown decisive. Without de Grasse's fleet controlling the Chesapeake and turning back Graves's relief attempt, Cornwallis could have evacuated or been reinforced, and the campaign would have produced no result. The Battle of the Chesapeake, a fleet action fought offshore on a September afternoon, determined Yorktown, and Yorktown determined the peace. Chance and timing played roles that no strategy fully controls. The fog at the East River on the night of August 29, 1776, helped conceal the final boats. The winter storm that made the Delaware crossing so difficult in December also helped conceal the movement of Washington's force. De Grasse's decision to bring his full fleet north, rather than a portion of it, gave the French numerical advantage over Graves. Cornwallis's choice of Yorktown as his defensive position placed him where his army could be surrounded by land and cut off by sea. Different decisions, different weather, different timing could have produced different outcomes at any of these moments. The revolution was not inevitable. What the revolution was, by the time its last soldiers had been demobilized and its final diplomatic instrument had been signed, was an accomplished fact. A nation of roughly 3 million people, stretched along the Atlantic seaboard and pushing steadily westward, had separated from the British Empire and been recognized as an independent state by the major powers of Europe. The independence that had been declared in Philadelphia in July 1776 had been tested, threatened, nearly extinguished, and ultimately confirmed through 8 years of fighting, diplomacy, hardship, and negotiation. The boats that crossed the East River in the fog of August 1776 carried men who had not yet survived the winter of 1776 to 1777, who had not yet heard of Saratoga or Valley Forge, who did not know that a French fleet would one day control the Chesapeake and trap a British army in Virginia. They knew only that they were still in the fight, and that being still in the fight was, for the moment, enough. As the United States reaches its 250th anniversary, the distance between that fog-wrapped river and the present is both immense and surprisingly short. The arguments about the proper scope of federal power, the meaning of constitutional rights, the relationship between military force and civilian authority, these are not new arguments. They are the same arguments that the Revolution began and that have been conducted in every generation since, in legislatures and courtrooms and town squares across a country that exists because enough people made enough difficult decisions in enough uncertain moments. The Revolution did not resolve its contradictions, it passed them forward. Liberty was claimed by people who owned slaves. Sovereignty was asserted over land belonging to nations who had not consented. Political rights were extended to some and withheld from others in ways that generations of struggle have incrementally addressed and continue to address. What the Revolution did produce was a political framework capable of being argued about, capable of being interpreted and reinterpreted, capable of being expanded and challenged. It produced a republic that its founders expected to be fragile, and that has proved more durable than most of them dared hope. And it produced, in the imperfect lives of the people who built it, a set of questions that still define what it means to claim, in the language of 1776, that all of these things are self-evident. Thank you for spending this night in history. 250 years is a long way from a fog-covered river and 9,000 exhausted soldiers in wooden boats, and in some sense, it is no distance at all. If there is one question from this story you're still turning over as you rest, I would love to hear it in the comments. Whatever you're wondering about the war, about the people who lived through it, about what it meant and what it left unresolved, bring it along. This kind of history rewards the questions that stay with you. Until the next journey, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.